Hey everybody, EliteFerrex here, and today we're going to take a look at a song from the Heritage A Dragon's Tale soundtrack, the Overworld Theme. So as usual, I'd like to let you hear the full track before we go ahead and start taking it apart, so let's go ahead and give it a listen. So first we have our little intro pattern here, this one. And if we break this down one piece at a time, you can see the main source of melody for this one is these three 12.5 pulse tracks. So this one we have here, centered. And that's it for that one. Then we have these ones on the left and right, which are the same notes, but transposed up or down an octave from each other. And then you notice each one of these also has an echo channel that goes along with it. So put together, here's what they sound like. Once those play their little intro, we have these 25 lead channels that come in here. This one centered, and then a left and right delay. And those sound like this. So there's those. That gives us kind of our little bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. Gives us like our little heroic brass blast there at the end. So then while those are going, we have our tri-bass here, my preferred bass synth as usual. Very simple bass melody there. And then I do have a pulse bass here, but you notice it doesn't come in until the last part there. And then we have these crashes that come in, kick, and hats, and that's all our percussion. And that's it for the intro. So as you'll notice, real quick, let's take a closer look at these 12.5 channels here. So we have our main little melody. And then our delay channel for this is the same notes, but you notice they've been moved forward a bit there. Now, this appears offset a little bit because this one is actually not 4/4 time. So you notice if I put this to third step, now it aligns properly, because this song is actually like a 6 notes per bar. It's kind of a bump 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 bump, that kind of like march sound to it. It's a rarity for me. I actually very rarely compose songs in this time signature, but for this one it just felt right. If I put this to 1/3 beat, you can see our delay for each channel is set forward 2 spots there, and that gives us this little delay effect. And then as usual as well, you'll notice I have the delay channels turned down in volume to about half the volume of the channel that they are echoing. And that's to prevent it from getting too loud, especially when these are all playing at the same time on top of each other. For this 25 lead here, you notice these ones come in here on the 3rd beat. And then if I go to the delays, they are moved forward 1 step. there as opposed to 2. And the reason I vary those with each other is because I find that the longer you delay the notes for the echo, the more ambient and spacey a sound you can get. Whereas if you keep them closer together, it has a little bit punchier sound to it. So as you compose your own songs, sometimes you may want to experiment how long you delay those notes out from each other to see what sounds right based on the situation you're in. And then nothing fancy here for the tri-bass. It's just fairly simple notes. The bum 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 bum. And then we move into the next section there. So let's go ahead and take a look at pattern 2. So in our second pattern, we get into the main melody of this track, which is a leitmotif that is carried across from several other tracks and is kind of the game's main theme in a way. It plays in the title screen theme, it plays in some of the cutscene tracks, and it plays in the level theme for the first level of the game. So I'll go ahead and play that lead melody here for you first. So there's our lead melody, and there's actually no harmony on it there, but I do have these left and right 12.5 channels to fill in the sides there while these notes are playing in the center. While those are playing, we have our bass, and now we've added in this pulse bass, much quieter than the triangle bass, and those, now we have the bass line of the track going there, while those other notes are playing. So there's our bass line, and then we have our percussion. And you'll notice we actually start off with a percussion that's very slow, kind of a waving back and forth, not a very fast-paced percussion. Even though these hats appear very quick in the time here, it's, again, giving it sort of a march effect. So you'll hear what I mean as soon as I play it. And I'll play it with the bass so you can kind of hear the effect it has. So you see what I mean by having the percussion there. Even though there's a lot of hats happening there, the overall feel of this section is very slow. It makes it sound to me like we're not in a sprint. We're in a long, adventurous, more like a hike than a sprint, which since we're on the overworld, we're crossing large distances and, moving around from one major area of the story to another. So I felt that was appropriate given the setting for what would be happening while this song was playing there. So one of the things about this first section here is it's very similar to the section that follows pattern 3. The only real difference is, whereas here in the first section, you'll hear this lead melody is played by these 25 leads here. Once we move on here to pattern 3, you'll notice that the leads shift to these 12.5 leads. And the notes are similar, but a little bit different because, again, one of the things I mention frequently when it comes to 8-bit music, and really any instrumental music in general, is that you want to keep that melody changing so that it continues to feel new and it doesn't feel boring or repetitive. One of the things about instrumental music is when you don't have lyrics for the listener to focus on, you always have to keep the melody changing so that the song does not sound stagnant and it continues to grow from the beginning to the end. So in the first one, it was these instruments here. And now in section 3, we've transitioned into these 12.5 synths. In the first part here, there's another change I want to point out, because since I've been talking about keeping the melody changing each time. In the second pattern, you'll notice the notes for these 12.5 synths are a little bit shorter. bum, 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 bum. So we've got these shorter notes that carry through, whereas in the third pattern for these 12.5 lead notes, they're longer. There is no break. It constantly goes. Ba-na, ba-na-na, ba-na, ba-na-na-na, ba-na-na-na-na-na. So now it has this sort of ongoing wavy kind of feel instead of this bum 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 bum. So it, again, changing the feel as we move from one part of the track to another. Another difference here is our bass notes, because again, we're going to be moving into the next section of the song, so we have to make sure that our bass doesn't stay the same either. So while we've got those changes happening there with the lead, our bass notes also change. So at the end of the second pattern, the bass sets us up for a repetition, whereas in the third pattern here, we have those bass notes resolve and prepare us to move on to a different section of the melody. So again, here I'll play them side by side. And again, we're repeating the notes, whereas here we're getting ready to move on to the next section. Again, keeping those things changing so it sounds different as we move along. And I know I say that a lot, but that's because it's really, really important to your composition to make sure in an instrumental track that you keep things fresh for your listener so that they don't get bored. And you notice I'm not making major changes here. I'm switching the lead from one instrument to another and slightly modifying the notes. I'm changing up the rhythm of the bass notes a little bit. And really that's it. You know, these side notes, the 12.5s on the left and right, have not changed. They're almost identical. And it's just small changes, but it really does make a big difference. So in the fourth pattern, we now transition again to a different lead instrument so that the song starts to sound a little different. So this is these square lead notes that play here, and I'll play them for you, and then we'll see how we transitioned into them. So now this is different than the pattern before, as we really didn't have the square notes doing much. So all I did is added some very short square lead notes to transition us into this lead, and you'll hear them as they come in at the end. So that gets us ready for the next section just by having a brief musical transition there with these square leads at the end. Instead of immediately jumping into the bum, 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 we introduce it with those brief square notes at the end, the bum, 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 bum. And that way it keeps things flowing naturally and we don't have a jarring transition from the third pattern there to the fourth one. Now, one of the other new features in the fourth pattern is now we have the 25 lead here with these arpeggiated up and downward notes that help fill in the background. So you can hear those here. So that's one change. In addition, I have these slow 12.5 left and right notes up here. And the reason I called them slow is they have a very long release time. So you can see in the actual piano roll, it's a very short note there, but the long release time gives it that very slow fade out. So it's bum, 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 bum. So you can hear what those sound like here. And so those, again, are there just to kind of help fill it up a little bit. Now, another major change has taken place here in pattern 4. Whereas here in pattern 3, we had these bass notes that were a little bit faster. Here in pattern 4, now we move to these long, slow, sweeping bass notes like this. So again, this is because I now want to emphasize that this isn't going to be a quick journey. You know, I want to emphasize the fact that it's going to take time. It's a long distance to cover. It's a big world, you know? So I've switched to these now kind of slow notes and emphasized that even though the bass notes have slowed down, there's these quicker notes on the sides that it's kind of like, even though it's a long journey, there's still going to be lots of little things that happen on the way, right? And if you think about this in like the course of a great undertaking or someone's life, you know, there's lots of little ups and downs along the way, which is kind of the idea that I had with these notes on the side. So even though at times the journey may be long, as indicated by these tri-bass and pulse bass notes, we also have lots of little ups and downs along the way, the 25 lead and the 25 delay channels. Right, so we've got those, and then just to kind of fill in the space there, we have these 12.5 left and rights, and then the square lead melody that comes in. Before I play all of those together though, I want to switch to the percussion here, because you'll notice now our hats have slowed way down compared to how they were before. Before it was this, but now we've switched into this slow, you know, this, which you'll hear here now. As the bass has slowed down, the percussion has slowed down to match the bass. We go from this kind of a little bit faster feeling here in pattern 3 to this slow pace here in the 4th pattern. Now you notice from the first half of the 4th pattern here, it kind of starts off and then wraps right back around to where it was. So in the second half, we got to change something. We got to make it feel different. So as compared to the first one, this da 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 da. Now we're going to add a different feeling for the rest of the track, starting right here. So as we transition now into the 5th pattern, now the track has a very different feeling to it. Whereas before we have this bright and happy major key in the 2nd, 3rd, and most of the 4th pattern. Now we're transitioning into this uncertain, even like maybe mildly foreboding sense as we get ready to move into the 5th pattern. We keep this going. We keep this sort of kind of slightly offsetting, little bit uncertain feeling until we get to the very end. And right before the song loops back around toward its beginning, we're given this feeling sort of that, you know, everything's going to be okay. Yeah, there's going to be challenges along the way. It might make us a little uncomfortable, a little bit scared, but we're going to get through it. It's going to be okay. That's kind of the general progression from beginning to end of the song. You know, since this is a song we're going to be hearing a lot and we want to signify that transition between a stage, you know, where it's going to be its own individual theme and this sort of overarching part of the adventure, we start with our little intro, the bum, 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 bum. And then we have our, you know, happy parts of the journey where we keep the leitmotif of the game's main theme, the bum, 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 bum. We have these happy notes that go over this sort of, you know, what a beautiful adventure feeling here. But then, you know, as we cross over a tall mountain, suddenly things seem a little bit uncertain. We're like, oh, that looks kind of dangerous. But we know we still have to do it. And so right before we go down into this, you know, I guess the little bit more foreboding section here, we have this brief note of positivity, like, all right, come on, we can do this. We're making our way through the difficulty here. It almost sounds a little bit sad there for a minute, but then we've got this resolve and the notes come back up and they take on this softer sort of tone before we have this building back up to that positive feeling at the end again. So that's sort of the general flow from beginning to end that I went for of the Overworld theme here. So to go back and kind of look at some of the individual instruments that were used in this track, we'll go ahead and start with the first lead that comes in here in the beginning, and that's these 12.5s right here. You'll notice all three of these 8-bit synths here are all 12.5s. They all have my go-to decay value of 0.06, a little bit lower sustain volume, and only the tiniest, shortest bit of release on the end. And you notice I have added a little bit of vibrato here as well. Just a depth of 0.15, so it's not a lot of vibrato. It's not like woo, woo, woo. It's just a little bit boo. And it takes about 0.3 seconds for it to come in. And so that gives us notes that sound like this. You can barely hear the vibrato in there, but it's just enough to give it a little bit of emphasis as we go through. You also notice because all three of these notes are playing at the same time, I have the bass channel volume set pretty low at 25%. Because otherwise it would be very easy for those notes to overpower everything else. And then again, for these delay channels that I have in here, the echo channels, this one's at 25, this one's at 12, this one's at 31, this one's at 16. So roughly half the volume on those delay or echo channels that we're using there. All I've done is set them a couple of notes ahead and reduce the volume, and that's all that was necessary. So the next one we'll look at is this 25 lead and its delay channels. And just like the 12.5s and their delays that we just looked at, the settings from the 25 lead and the 25 delay are the same. Nothing has changed. We do have a couple of differences between this 25 lead and those 12s that we were just looking at. First of all, this has a deeper vibrato effect, whereas the last one was only 0.15 and was barely noticeable. This one has a depth of 0.30 and is much more noticeable. You can hear it a little bit more there. Boom, right? The delay value is the same and the cycle length is the same. We also have a slightly louder sustain volume, so these ones play at a little bit louder volume. Instead of 0.5, which is half volume, this one is 0.6, 60% volume, and the release value is even shorter. So there is still a release. It does take a very short amount of time for the note to cut off. It's not immediate and abrupt, but it's so fast that it's almost not noticeable. And this one also has a custom duty cycle here. So you notice since it starts off at 0, if you've looked at the detailed tutorial that I posted for Magical8Bit 2, you'll see that this actually starts off at a 0 value, which is a 12.5%, and then ends with a duty value of 1, which is a 25%. And it takes 3 frames for you to get there, so 3/60ths or 1/20th of a second for that to happen. It's a very quick transition, and then the rest of the note is played as a 12.5. Now these volume notes here, or the volume values here, I was messing around with it, but you see the box is unchecked, so those are actually not being factored in to the final sound here, right? And so that's what we've got for these 25 leads. And again, you'll notice the 25 lead channel is set to 34% volume. Its delays are set to 16, so just under 50% volume. And that tends to be my go-to. Normally when I have echo or delay channels, they're about 50% quieter than the lead that they are echoing. So our next lead is this 12.5 lead that I have highlighted here in magenta. And so these ones are, again, 34% on the volume, and the delays are 16%, so the exact same volume values that we had for those red 25 leads and their delays. This one, again, does have a couple of other changes. This one, our decay is a value of 0.02 instead of 0.06, so it very quickly goes from starting maximum value to its sustained value of 60%. So whereas the others take 0.06, this one is only 0.02 seconds on the decay, meaning it's a third of the time. It happens much faster. And I chose that for this because it gives the note still the same punchy start, but then quickly reduces that volume down to where I want it to be. It also has a much longer release value. This one has a release value of 0.1, 1/10 of a second compared to the others that we've seen so far. Our cycle length for the vibrato is also a little bit longer. So instead of the vibrato, and I'm overemphasizing here, but instead of the vibrato being it takes a little longer. So that's what that means. We still have a depth of 0.30 and a delay of 0.30, so we've matched the other one there. And down on the duty cycle, this one we're starting off at a 1, which is a 25, not actually a 12.5. And then we go to a 0, which is the 12.5, what we wind up hearing for the majority of the note, and it takes us 2 frames to get there. So 2/60ths or 1/30th of a second for that to happen. And that gives us these notes. Next up, we have our 2 bass synths. The triangle bass and the pulse bass is actually a 25% pulse. It starts off here showing 12.5 right here, but again, if you look down at the custom duty envelope, it starts off at a 12.5 and then after 3 frames transitions to a 12.5. So what we are really hearing for the majority of the note is a 12.5. Now there is a difference in volume between our triangle bass and the pulse bass. Our triangle, as our main bass, I have set to a value of 62%. Our pulse bass is much quieter at 28%. And that's because the bass notes are very noticeable. And if they were both a very high volume level, they would overpower the rest of the track easily. So I've chosen a much lower value for the pulse bass just to add kind of an accent to the notes of the triangle bass, not to really mix and hear them in equal parts, if that makes sense. You'll also notice as we got into another portion of the track a little bit later, we've got these changes in the note volume here. Right here for the triangle bass, you'll notice it goes from full volume to half volume, full volume to half volume. To keep the bass note changing so it's not ba 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 ba, it's ba 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 ba. And again, the whole purpose behind that is to keep that sort of change, that sort of march feeling that's been going on, the bum 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 bum. So we want to keep that feeling changing as we move along. And if I go to the pulse bass here, you'll notice the notes are the same volume level there. When we get to the channel 4 here, as you notice, we go to these lower volume by comparison, whereas here most of the bass notes are at nearly full volume. In pattern 4, we've reduced the volume of the triangle bass and brought up the volume of the pulse bass a little bit. And that is mostly because I wanted to have a difference in the sound there, right? I just wanted the notes to sound a little different to keep them changing as we go. And you can kind of hear the transition here. Anyway, you get the idea there. As we get to different parts, you will notice that I change the, occasionally I change whether the tri-bass and the pulse bass are playing the same notes or whether they're changed. Like here, you notice the pulse bass note is down here on octave 2, and the tri-bass is up here on octave 3. And a lot of times that just winds up being a matter of personal choice and how you want it to sound at that particular part. It's just your own preference as you go and try different things. And then you can see here at the end too, the pulse bass goes way up here into the 4 and 5s, while the tri-bass is still down here in the 3s and 4s. And again, that's just a matter of, as you get to different parts, fine-tuning how you want individual sections to sound. There's no golden rule to follow there. It's really up to you. And the last section for us to look at is our percussion here. So we've got our kick, our hats, our clap or snare, whichever you prefer to call it, and these crash notes. For our kick, I'm using my standard settings that I do here. We've got the decay value of 0.15 and a sustain value of 0. So this means that our note is starting off at full volume and then taking 0.15 seconds, or roughly a little longer than 1/8 of a second, to go from full volume to 0, because the sustain is set to 0. So this is what we get. Now down here on the pitch, you notice I have this set to go from a pitch value of 12, which is slightly above the note that I'm pressing, going down to -64, which is way down there. And it takes 10 frames, or 1/6 of a second, to do that. And that's because if we don't have that pitch going downward, then we don't get a boof, boof, which gives us that kick sound. Instead, we get this, which is not what we want. We want to make sure we have that kick sound, so we want to have that pitch go down so that we get that, instead of boop, boop, we get boop, boop. So that's why we've got it set that way. Now, this is a percussion instrument, so I don't want any vibrato on it or anything. I just feel like that would sound weird. You can always experiment and see what works for you, but I didn't think I would want it here, so I have it set to 0. And so really that's it. The kick itself is just the downward pitching note with a decay value of 0.15. And so very simple for that one. For my short noise, the decay time is 0.04, so 1/25th of a second on that. Does not take very long for it to get there. And again, no vibrato or anything like that. So that gives us these here. So those are our little hats, and those I've got set to the 4-bit noise value there, the higher pitched ones. And you can see those I have set. My general go-to, is somewhere right around here near the C7. A little bit higher sometimes a little bit lower. And I tend to keep the note volume high here, but the channel volume fairly low. About 50% is roughly where I tend to keep my noise percussions across tracks. And you can always adjust it up and down a little bit, either there or in the individual pattern velocity for the notes. Your choice in how you go about it. For my mid noise, this is roughly the same. It's still a 4-bit pure random like the last one. The only difference is this one has a decay value of 0.15. So actually the same length as our kick, but you can see the difference between the short and the mid length. The short was 0.04, so roughly a 25th of a second, and this one is 0.15, roughly a 7th or 8th of a second. So it's just a little bit longer, so you can hear the difference here in those two. So we've got that, and that's the difference that decay makes. The decay, the short time, gives us that really quick versus the longer decay gives us the because it takes it longer for the note to end. And then our last one here is the noise crash. Oh, before I get into that, let me look at the mid here and see what note I chose. Okay, so I chose B3 this time. Somewhere around there is normally where I will go, between the C3 and the C4 range, somewhere in there, and I choose a note based on how it sounds when I hear it next to the rest of the track. It varies from time to time, but normally it's somewhere within that range is my go-to. And then the last one we have is this noise crash, which is kind of like our cymbal effect. In pattern 1, we have 3 of them in a row here. To look at how those are set, again, the same settings all around as the other one. It's still a 4-bit. The only difference is this one has a much longer decay time, 0.6, so over a half a second. And that's it. So we've got our 3 noise values. The only difference between the 3 is how long it takes for them to decay. This one takes 0.04 seconds, this one takes 0.15 seconds, and this one takes 8.6 seconds. So I hope this has been an insightful look for you into the track that I wanted to share with you today, the Overworld theme from Heritage, A Dragon's Tale. I really enjoyed making this track because, as I explained earlier, I like the dynamic feeling between, you know, the positive outlook of an adventure and the more uncertain, you know, oh, I don't know if I can do this. This is a really big, you know, task for me to do kind of thing. And having the notes reflect that in the scales that play, and the difference between longer notes and shorter notes and how it all works together. It's one of my favorite things about this soundtrack is that so many of the tracks have lots of emotion put into them that really tries to carry along what is happening in the game itself at that time and help it all sort of feel like a connected experience as we go through. So anyway, I hope you learned something watching the video today. Let me know in the comments your thoughts, maybe what your favorite part of what you learned today was, or which part of the song is your favorite, or if you've listened to the soundtrack of the game, maybe which song you'd like me to look into next. But that's all for now. It's about an hour away until Christmas my time, so hopefully, however you're celebrating, happy holidays to you, and have a great season. I'll see you again another time.